Pinto! You're covered on all sides! Raise your hand!
You're traveling to another dimension. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
There were several Twilight Zones that took place in the Old West. The use of this setting makes sense for this era of television. During the 50s and 60s, shows such as Bonanza, Gunsmoke, and Have Gun Will Travel were very popular. The episode we'll be discussing today is called The Grave, and this is actually the first Western from the Fifth Dimension I'm covering. But this isn't just a tale about the Old West, it's also a ghost story. The Grave was episode 7 from season 3, and it was written and directed by veteran Twilight Zone talent Montgomery Pittman. As always, spoilers are ahead.
We've had the traditional shootout on the street, and the bad man will soon be dead. But some men of legend and folktale have been known to continue having their way even after death. The outlaw and killer Pinto Sykes was such a person. And shortly we'll see how he introduces the town and a man named Connie Miller, in particular, to the Twilight Zone.
The Grave opens strong, tossing us into the aftermath of a violent shootout. The outlaw Pinto Sykes has been taken down by some locals, and soon after, our lead, Connie Miller, as played by Lee Marvin, rides into town.
Why'd you fence off that piece of street down there?
It's his blood.
Whose blood?
Pinto Sykes.
Director Montgomery Pittman was no stranger to the Western genre. He had writing credits for other Western series, such as Maverick and Sugarfoot, which happened to feature some familiar faces from the Twilight Zone. So he was definitely the right guy for the job. And for a relatively small television production, I'd say everything here feels authentic. The inhabitants appear run down, and the dusty, battered town is the perfect backdrop for this Old West ghost story. And, as we all know, every spooky tale needs some howling wind. That's an element Montgomery Pittman insisted on.
Well, look at what the wind blowed in.
The second Connie walks into the saloon, you immediately feel tension in the air. Connie was hired to track down Pinto Sykes. Since he failed to do so, the locals were forced to take action themselves. However, gunning down a known killer isn't something any of them wanted to do, so it's understandable why Connie isn't welcomed with open arms.
4 months of the year wasted looking for him. I could have found him here.
Connie claims he was simply unable to catch up with Pinto, but the problem is, on his deathbed, Pinto Sykes told a very different version of the story.
He claimed you didn't even try to catch up to him.
He said, the slower he ran away, the slower you chased him.
Unfortunately for Connie, the more these guys reveal about what Pinto said on his deathbed, the worse it gets for him.
If you ever come anyways close to his grave, he'll reach up and grab you.
So, we as viewers are left to decide who's telling the truth. Was Connie actually afraid to confront Pinto, or was he really a step behind him the whole time, and this is just a matter of Pinto telling lies in his dying moments to damage Connie's reputation?
He lied, even on his deathbed.
The Grave features a very small cast, and that's something that works out pretty well. This is meant to be a small town. Everyone knows everyone. And that sense of familiarity comes through between all of the players. There are certainly standouts in this group, such as Johnny Robb, as played by James Best. Best had a career that spanned decades. He's probably most known as Roscoe P. Coltrane from The Dukes of Hazzard.
Them Duke boys, they'll be coming by here just any moment now. I can feel it in my bones.
Here, he's basically the ringleader who gets under Connie's skin the most.
Hello, Johnny Robb.
Stafford Rapp also appears as Ira the bartender. He's the one guy who gives Connie the least amount of grief. I mainly know him as Chief O'Hara from the classic 60s Batman. Of course, it's impossible to miss Lee Van Cleef, who portrays Steinhardt. He doesn't get a lot of screen time, but a guy like this makes an impression. Lee Van Cleef is someone even casual fans of westerns will probably recognize from Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where he starred alongside the legendary Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach. Perhaps the most interesting of this bunch is Pinto's sister, Ione Sykes, as played very well by Ellen Willard.
My brother and I were just talking about you. Just the day before yesterday. He's real sorry. He's been missing you.
It feels like there's history between Connie and Ione, but what's even more evident is their bad blood. Ione may be grieving, but she clearly holds a grudge against Connie and delights in tormenting him.
You've been chasing him for so long, Connie. You ought to feel lucky tonight. You know right where he is.
It's one thing for the townspeople to be jittery about the ghost of Pinto Sykes, but when his sister doubles down on his vow to take vengeance on Connie, that adds fuel to the fire. This supernatural element within the story is handled very well. We barely see Pinto Sykes at all, other than when he's gunned down in the opening. Yet, his eerie presence is felt throughout.
I was never afraid of Pinto when he was alive. And I sure ain't afraid of him now that he's dead.
And I don't believe that.
Where this story makes a turn is when the men bet Connie that he doesn't have the guts to visit Pinto's grave at midnight.
Keep the bottle on the bar, Ira. I won't be long.
With his now damaged reputation on the line, Connie takes the bet and even vows to stick a knife into Pinto's grave as proof of his visit. On his way to Pinto's resting place, Connie runs into Ione, who once again has some creepy words for him.
He's waiting for you.
For me, the graveyard scene is easily the highlight of this episode. This is where we get even deeper into ghost story territory. Everything has been building to this moment, so by the time we get there, I found myself anxious to see where this was all going. As Connie roams through the graveyard, he's noticeably shaken. But he eventually locates the grave, and as promised, he plants the knife into the ground. The next morning, everyone visits the cemetery in search of Connie, and they find him dead on top of Pinto's grave. So the glaring question is, what the hell happened? It's noted by Steinhardt that the knife was accidentally driven through Connie's coat, and that's what pinned him to the ground. So maybe the mere thought that Pinto was grabbing him from the grave made Connie die of fright. Ione is there, and she has a very different take. She points out that the wind direction from the previous night would have blown Connie's coattail away from the grave, not over it. From there, we close out with her laughing fiendishly.
Final comment. You take this with a grain of salt or a shovelful of earth as shadow or substance. We leave it up to you. And for any further research, check under G for Ghosts in the Twilight Zone.
So there you have it, The Grave. Definitely a spooky one. Now, I already talked about some of my favorites from the cast, but I have to mention the lead, Lee Marvin. Marvin was best known for roles in films such as The Killers, The Dirty Dozen, and The Big Red One. He also won an Academy Award for Best Actor for his dual role in the comedy western Cat Ballou. Marvin was excellent as Connie Miller. In fact, his casting is yet another reason I think this episode works so well. Here we have a story about a hard-boiled gunslinger from the Old West. It makes total sense to bring in Lee Marvin, a classic Hollywood tough guy, right down to the deep, bassy voice.
I'm gonna tell you something, boy. I don't like you. I never have, and I don't reckon I ever will.
Interestingly, by casting Marvin, we're given some breathing room to interpret this story more freely. On the surface, it would seem a guy like Connie would never cower from an outlaw, much less a dead outlaw. But by taking this supposed tough guy and putting him on a spot where his rep is on the line, and he has to prove himself by marching up to the grave of a dead man, suddenly things get more interesting.
You people know me. How come all of a sudden you think I'm afraid?
Because we'd be afraid.
We do get some hints that suggest Connie may not have been so brave after all. For example, when Ione first enters the saloon, Connie's quick to draw his weapon. But more importantly, as I noted earlier, in the graveyard scene, Connie is clearly rattled by this situation. I feel like in this moment, if Connie was actually fearless, then it's more likely he'd march up to the grave and plant the knife without hesitation.
I know that I got a man killed.
That brings us to the conclusion. This ending is meant to be ambiguous, and that's reinforced by Rod Serling's closing narration. Granted, sometimes it can be frustrating when a story is left open-ended, but here I think it works. A lot of this story leaves it up to the viewer to decide who's telling the truth and who's lying, so it feels natural that we close with an ending that's open to interpretation. Since this is the Twilight Zone, I generally lean towards supernatural explanations myself, so I'm going with Zombie Pinto for the win. Where exactly did this story come from? Well, as I noted up front, the director, Montgomery Pittman, was credited as the writer, but in unlocking the door to a television classic by Martin Grams Jr., we're given a few other things to consider. First up, Pittman himself recounts he was inspired to write The Grave from a ghost story his father told him many times as a child whenever the wind was blowing. However, after this episode aired, Rod Serling received a letter from a viewer who claimed the story had been told before and was a replica of a short story from Russian author Chekhov. To muddy the situation even more, James Best, who played Johnny Robb in this very episode, claimed he gave Pittman the idea for this tale, as he'd been a fan of ghost stories as well.
Why don't you shut up before you really get hurt?
The Grave is also considered by some to be an adaptation of Maria Leach's The Dare and The Path Through the Cemetery by Leonard Q. Ross. Either way, I still enjoyed this fifth dimension spin on the ghost story.
That's the end of that.
One final note. Rod Serling actually wrote alternate versions of his closing narration, one of which goes as follows. Legend, folktale, shadow or substance, we leave it up to you. Take it with tongue-in-cheek or question mark in mind. But if you plan to put it to a test, find a friendly grave and make your overtures in daylight. That's tonight's suggestion from the Twilight Zone. I think that says it all. I'd rate The Grave 4 out of 5 knives stuck in graves. Before I go, I wanted to mention something for those of you out there who are fans of the Western genre. I highly recommend checking out The Good, The Bad, and The Okay. This is a great channel that offers up spoiler-free reviews of Westerns, giving them a score of the good, the bad, or the okay. The channel is run by Leslie, a fellow YouTuber who I've gotten to know over the last few months. Show some support, he has top-notch content, and again, if you love Westerns, that's the place to be. Alright, that's it for me. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've seen The Grave and have your own thoughts on the episode, feel free to comment below. If you enjoyed this review, hit that sub button, hit that like button, and while you're at it, the notification bell is right there, so have at it. Until next time, take care, be well, and stay away from Pinto Sex Grave. Later.